Good afternoon, everyone. We will soon begin the webinar Responding to Crisis, What to Learn from African Experiences. My name is Johanna Felenius, Communications Officer for Events here at the Nordic Africa Institute. And before we start, I want to share with you some general information. Today's moderator, Amanda Hammar, Professor of African Studies at University of Copenhagen, will welcome questions from the audience. If you have a question, please share it in the Q&A function here in Zoom so that it can be addressed towards the final part of the webinar. With that, I'm happy to hand over to Amanda Hammar. The room is yours, Amanda.
Thank you very much, Johanna, and hi everyone. As Johanna has introduced me, I'm Amanda Hammar. I'm a professor at the Center of African Studies at Copenhagen University. I'm also the president currently of the European African Studies Association. I'm a Zimbabwean and have done some urban work on urban politics, displacement and change in Zimbabwe. And prior to becoming an academic around 1997, for an extensive period, I was also working on aspects of development planning and policy for and with the post-independent Zimbabwe state. And I mention all of this just to indicate how invested I am in today's discussions. So with that, it's really my pleasure and my honor to welcome you all, both on behalf of and also with thanks to both the editors and authors of the DIY Urbanism in Africa volume and to the Nordic Africa Institute, and to welcome you to today's roundtable on Responding to Crises, What to Learn from African Experiences. So the event has two interrelated intentions. On the one hand, it's an opportunity for the editors and selected authors of this excellent collection to DIY Urbanism in Africa to showcase its combined contributions to urban scholarship, to African studies scholarship, to development studies scholarship, and much more beyond. On the other hand, it's an opportunity for the research in this book, including both its innovative theorizing and rich empirical insights, to speak to and be heard by Northern and especially Nordic policymakers, practitioners, and other academics. And specifically, this is with respect to diverse African modes of making and managing urban space in the face of multiple and often chronic crises. So especially with regard to this latter point about the engagement between this book and others, at the heart of this conversation is the question of what it means to have African and Africanist perspectives placed at the center of global knowledge-making concerning the urban. And that is reversing the historically distorted naturalizing of a different order of things, whereby the global north has most often been positioned or self-positioned to offer theory, learning, and advice to the global south. So this book and this conversation are rather conscious moments of reversal, situated within an increasing decolonial shift, more generally, in which we are asking what the North can learn from the South. So just as much as we acknowledge that Northern theory and practice is particular to its own contexts and therefore not automatically generalizable or universalizable, so we need to recognize the opposite as well, that African experiences and knowledges are particular. So we're therefore aware that quite radically different contexts and conditions are at play in such a North-South conversation. So for many African countries, crisis is chronic, sustained or by or through government neglect at best, and deliberate forms of state exclusion, accumulation, and violence at worst. So for the majority, urban poor and marginalized in African cities, the absence of public security and services and everyday precarity is a norm, but so too are creative strategies and self-provisioning. At the same time, political conditions across the continent have implications for the kinds of citizenships and the kind of citizen publics and actions that are possible. For countries like Sweden or other Nordic or European countries, other than those currently embroiled in wars or remembering wars, crisis is a fairly distant future possibility. maybe violent crisis or climate crisis, which is already being experienced. At the same time, many such countries in the Nordics and Europe and so on are marked primarily by a relatively well-functioning state with a welfarist history in many cases of public responsibility and service provision, and so far still fairly strong democratic space for active citizenship. We see the tides for that changing and authoritarianism emerging in some parts of Europe and elsewhere. So the question is, excuse me, what might these different contexts be able to offer to one another? But more concretely, what might Nordic planners, policymakers, and practitioners, as well as academics, learn from African experiences of dealing with crisis, specifically through the lens of DIY urbanism? So in relation to that challenge, we look forward to the presentations and provocations from our 5 panelists today. So now let me turn to introduce our panelists. So I'm really, really proud to introduce the 5 that are going to speak today, but just to note that I'm just giving snapshots of who they are. There's a whole lot more of their life histories, accomplishments, capacities you're not going to hear about from me just now, but let me introduce you to them in the order in which they will be speaking. So first, Patience Mususa, who is one of the 2 co-editors of the DIY Urbanism in Africa book. She's a senior researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute in Uppsala. She's an environmental anthropologist with a PhD from the University of Cape Town in anthropology. Her research interests cover mining and mining towns, planning and urbanization, and community welfare, with a regional focus on southern Central Africa and especially Zambia, from where she comes. She works at the intersections of research, policy, and practice, and among other publications, she's the single author of the monograph, There Used to Be Order, Life on the Copper Belt After the Privatization of the Zambia Consolidated Copper Mines. So we know where she is coming from. So the second person to introduce you to is Stephen Marr, who has partnered Patient in the co-editing of this book. And he is a senior lecturer in the Department of Global Political Studies at Malmö University in southern Sweden. He has a PhD in political science from the University of Florida, with a specialization, and this really comes across in his work, in comparative politics, political theory, and African studies. His current research interrogates issues of climate adaptation, DIY urbanism, and equitable and just sustainable urban development, both in African cities and the post-industrial American Midwest. So he's now at work on a comparative project that brings in places Detroit in conversation with sub-Saharan African cities like Lagos and maybe Gaborone, if you're doing that as well. I'm not sure. You've worked in Botswana. More generally, Stephen's research emphasizes approaches that seek to position African-focused urban theory and African urban dynamics at the center of contemporary urban scholarship. And I think that speaks also to what we're intending here. Matthias Agbo Jr. is both an independent researcher and writer on urban sustainability questions and an experienced built environment designer and project manager. He's published extensively in both academic and popular publications on African architecture, urbanism, sustainability, and adaptation design. He has bylines in a remarkable diversity of media publications across the world. In addition, he runs a design and sustainability consultancy in Abuja, Nigeria, and particularly through that direction has collaborated with and consulted for organizations including UNDP, Nigeria's Office of the Vice President, the American University of Nigeria, as well as various private clients. And his work importantly bridges research, policy, and practice. Victoria Okoye is lecturer in Black Geographies at the Institute of Geography at the University of Edinburgh in the UK. Victoria holds a PhD in urban studies and planning from the University of Sheffield. She has a particular focus on West Africa and especially Ghana and Nigeria, where her professional, activist, and creative work has included mapping of sanitation and hygiene infrastructures, researching and mapping culture and heritage sites, co-organizing street art festivals and youth photography workshops and exhibitions, and researching inclusive urban planning with street market vendors. Her approach to research and to other broader community commitments are shaped by collaborations with artists, creatives, and cultural workers. And as she, I think it's important, as she's noted herself, from her position and heritage as a US-born Igbo diasporan. Jeffrey Palla holds multiple local academic positions, and I was just double checking with him earlier today if I had them correct, at least the current ones. He is an associate professor in the Department of Politics at the University of San Francisco and a researcher in the Department of Government at Uppsala University. He has a PhD in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the US. Jeffrey has an overall interest in and publishes on the political conditions under which democratic activity and accountability develop in poor urban communities, specifically in Africa. And linked to this, he is currently leading a research project entitled Building Sustainable Neighborhoods in African Cities, while he's also co-leading another project called Emerging Cities. That's a Swedish Research Council-funded research environment that examines political change and local governance in secondary cities. So as you can see, we have a wealth of knowledge, experience, commitment, passion amongst our panelists today, and I'm very excited to have them and to host them on your behalf. So we're going to go through a series of questions that I will ask the panelists, and I'm going to start with the first question to Patience. So Patience, among other things, both you and Stephen are urban scholars, as well as being located within the broad arena of African studies. So for a long time, that means you've been concerned with studying and understanding the making of cities in Africa, as well as elsewhere. But could you then please help us understand the origin story of the book DIY Urbanism in Africa? So why this book and why this book now?
Thank you, Amanda. No, it's exciting to have this conversation. And firstly, I mean, one has to say that the whole book project for Stephen and I would have not been possible without the contributions of all the authors. And one of our authors, sadly, Professor Mohammed Bello Yunisa, who we remember today, who passed on shortly after the book was published, but he wrote about urban hacking. So the genesis of the book project goes back to conversations between Stephen and I when he was at the Nordic Africa Institute as a visiting research fellow back in 2016, and we got talking about our respective areas of work. I'd been working, on looking at the experiences of crisis, as Amanda introduced earlier, of miners on the Zambian copper belt who had been laid off after a major restructuring of the economy. And I was very interested in the ways in which they made their life in the context of everyday challenges in terms of trying to find work and make a living in the context of no formal work anymore, dealing with water and energy crises in a context where they could not pay for those services. And Stephen, who had done work in Botswana and comes from the Midwest in Detroit. I mean, in Botswana, he had done his work at the time when Botswana, like many other Southern African countries, had been reeling from the effects of the HIV/AIDS crisis and the effects that had on society. So talking about living within a context of hope and despair. And talking also about the kind of broader context of the effects of financial crisis and how that effectively radically begins to restructure society. And he brought in conversations, I mean, from Detroit, looking at the effect of the financial crisis and its particular effect on the most vulnerable and marginalized communities in that context. And Stephen, who's a comparative urban scholar in conversation, kind of led us to kind of pushing had us pushing the conversation is that what does it mean to try and make a life in contexts where the state has either limited capacity or is in retreat, and how then, and what are the practical aspects of this, of actually doing and making a living within the city, but also broadly, what are the political ramifications around that? And here it's also good to kind of plug in a little bit about kind of, you know, the kind of broader background in kind of African urbanism, in that when we had these conversations, it was not a new topic. African urban scholars have been engaging with these questions for a significantly long time, and largely interrogating them through the questions of how is the city lived and experienced, who's included, how, you know, within the context of kind of long colonial histories, working with the new formal state. And so, but the conversation was, how do we push ourselves to think beyond that and to kind of make it relevant? And so in a kind of broad context, we decided to engage in this book project. And the question was, why now? Was informed by several things. One, the broader context of ongoing global austerity and neoliberal restructuring. But it also became, it resonated quite strongly while working on it when we both received a booklet from the MSB, the Swedish Civil Contingencies agents, on what to do when war or crisis comes. And it made us think that our joint planned edited collection had wider implications beyond African experiences. And so it pushed us to thinking, and here Stephen will talk a little bit more about it, of what analytical frameworks might allow us to step out in thinking about African experiences to see how they might resonate with broader global processes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's very clear, and a nice segue now into my first question to you, Stephen, if I may. Patience has framed it and sort of contextualized the sort of the moment of it. And there is the term DIY urbanism. Of course, that itself has a history, which is both outlined and also mentioned in various chapters that in the book. So it has a history, and it's not sort of a straight line. But there are also other kinds of terms or concepts that in some way refer to these aspects of the kinds of processes, practices, politics that you're addressing. So can you share with the audience why this was your concept of choice in particular, and what you hoped it could and would do?
Yes, I will do my best. So I had a little bit of a preface. I'm just going to get into it, but I do want to say thank you, Amanda, for the great questions. Thanks to the panelists for for being here today, and thank you to the audience. And I've been really looking forward to this. And so yeah, I'm not going to get too much into the different kinds of concepts that are out there, because you should read the book. And so that's that'll be a bit of a cliffhanger. But I do want to say that there are a large swath of terms and concepts in use today which we might have built upon. So things like informal urbanism or tactical urbanism or insurgent urbanism. And I think that these terminologies tend to emphasize more discrete, intermittent activities undertaken by individuals that are often understood or sort of evaluated as acts of resistance or appropriations of space by those without power. And I think we tried to, in the book, in our work, try to approach DIY urbanism a little bit differently, and that our conceptualization of DIY urbanism invites a way to think about how people who are often, but not always, living in precarious situations. So these could be spatial precarities, social, economic, infrastructural, resource scarce environments, and in which the state is only partially or unevenly present, or in which it might be incapable or unwilling to provide sort of municipal services. And so the question then becomes is then how do individuals or communities living within these kinds of conditions, how do they navigate, how do they endure, how do they sort of manage to survive these circumstances? Put another way, we might just ask more simply, how do people mitigate risk and attempt to solve problems? So that's kind of what we're after here. And I think our conceptualization does a few things differently, I think, in that it offers first a way to understand the myriad and sustained ways that urban residents make and manage their cities outside of formal or more formalized bureaucratic institutional channels. B, or two, it conceived as a sort of urban tinkering, we might say. Our understanding of DIY urbanism emphasizes the expertise and skills required of quote unquote regular people to navigate these conditions of say, resource or infrastructure deficiencies or scarcities, and in how they then assess and mitigate risk as best as possible. And an implication here, and I think this is maybe where the conversation might head sort of later on, is that residents of African cities have a grounded, what we might say like everyday expertise that's not often included beyond, say, perfunctory participatory consulting by planners or other sort of technocrats. But it should be. It should be sort of part of the conversation policymaking processes. Third, it emphasizes a political dimension that sees DIY urbanism as entangled with the state rather than it always happening sort of in opposition or parallel to it. And then a key question thus becomes, how can states learn from and best support what's already happening on the ground? And lastly, I would say by foregrounding the political dimensions of DIY urbanism, our conceptualization, I think, acknowledges that DIY practices are not only and always relegated to the marginal or to the powerless in a population, but rather urban elites are often able to leverage their position to make and manage the city to their own benefit, meaning that some forms of DIY urbanism become legitimated or authorized, while others are penalized or suppressed. And so I think from our perspective, like thus tries to account for how, to account for and acknowledge the significant power imbalances that are sort of at play in a city that become relevant for thinking about how we assess DIY urbanism.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you. That's very comprehensive. And I mean, there's a lot in there. And, you're right. People have to read the book to kind of get the fullness of what that is. But I do appreciate this last point that you made in terms of the sort of, it's not always on the margins, and that elites not only do informal DIY stuff, but that they have space to do it in way, there is differentiated citizenship, basically. So, and also they have very different relationships to the state, which is great. So thank you. Patience, I'm going to come back to you with the second question then. So this is more pragmatic. Developing an edited volume is both an exciting and a demanding process, and it involves labor that should not be underestimated for those of us who have edited volumes or special issues before. But in this particular collection, which is entailed the challenge of there being many in which there being many ways in which DIY urbanism itself is picked up by the different authors. There's different geographies. People are coming from different disciplines with a different focus on what they're writing about. Very rich and exciting. But given this diversity, and bearing in mind that you have, as editors, have to be concerned with an overall coherence of a collection, how did you as editors try and guide your 10 other authors in terms of developing their respective contributions to the book? So how did you manage and make use of the kinds of differences that inevitably rose that they brought into the book? So could you tell us a little bit about that process?
Yes, actually, it is a very iterative process. If one thinks about it as a kind of manipulative way of trying to get different conversations ongoing. But we do need to say that actually many of the initial discussions in being able to bring all the authors together in the room would have not been made possible without a stint initiation grant and the support of multiple institutions, the Institute of Urban Studies in Urban Research in Malmo, the Nordic Africa Institute, and the Sultan Machido Institute with the University of Abuja. So we had a workshop actually in Nigeria, Abuja, where several of the, quite a number of the contributors were, and it brought together practitioners, academics, civil society, and municipal actors, and it catalyzed an interesting discussion that covered broad aspects around community policing, like neighborhood watches, urban party politics, water provision, you know, kind of do it yourself water provision. But broadly, these conversations kind of had, like, what would say a number of intersecting themes that came through, that we worked with the authors during the process of writing, but also later when we included other authors, we organized a panel later at ECAS to also consolidate some other aspects of that conversation. And it was themes that I think Stephen may touch on and elaborate a little bit more on. Broad themes such as a broad democracy. What does participation mean within the urban when you are self-provisioning and doing things yourself, either individually or in groups? What does it mean? What is common, or what is a publics when they are both concurrent forces of privatizing space, but also purling it? And here Victoria will speak a little bit more to that. And also issues of trust that underpin kind of politics in the organizing of activities, you know, relations with the state, relations with neighbors, and the like, but also broadly the political economy of it. This is doing, it requires resources, it requires effort. And just to kind of plug in a little bit, and just to get people interested to read the book, there's interesting kind of discussions that emerged around when you're organizing policing or your own security, or you know, what happens then to issues of social cohesion. And here, Victor de Tula and Henrik Angerbrandt, you know, deal with some of these aspects in the collection. And issues around belonging and democratic participation. Martin Murray, Victoria Koye, and Matthias here in the room touch on aspects of that within the work. But then there's also the histories, and Amanda, you spoke to that in the introduction, around colonial histories of exclusion, and the like. How do they play into what people and what people can do, or what space affords people to do? And here Jennifer Hart and Mohammed Bello, Eunice and Steve himself write a little bit about that. And then there's the effect of the kind of wider body politics, right? When you're doing things yourself, and its effect on different populations and constituencies, health, ability, and the like. Jonathan Makwira and myself touch on aspects on that. And we're all living within the context of the climate crisis. And we're really pleased to have the contributions of Antje Daniels and Federico Monica, who had worked in Cape Town and Liberia, respectively, dealing with how do you imagine cities, you know, that might be used to repurpose, using recycling to repurpose, and or to deal with flood defenses. So I will end there, but that's a little bit of a touch of, we brought these conversations together, tying those particular aspects that around self-provisioning.
That's great. I mean, as you pointed out, it's not that one wanted to have a line and a prescription, but actually that's the richness that sort of unfolded and gets evoked by a term that Stephen, you know, sort of talked about, an opening up. And I mean, there's plenty of things. If it was just you and me in conversation, I'd go, and what about this? And but we'll come to that. Hopefully some of the audience might pick up on certain things. But let me come back to you, Stephen, now with another question, which is more about comparativism, I think, and conversation. So the book, as we know, in its own right, both conceptually and empirically, is very rich and valuable as an offering for studies, for scholarship, and so on. But as this event itself makes evident, there are also other ambitions for its usefulness. So namely, in what ways can it bring into conversation, or bring to conversations with planners, practitioners, or activists, both in African and other global South contexts, but also especially in the global North in this particular moment. So in this regard, I mentioned in my opening the challenge inherent in juxtaposing these very different contexts, right? But you yourself have chosen quite pointedly to undertake comparative work between urban African settings, as we know, Detroit, your own sort of hometown, I think, yes, and African settings. So how do you yourself, and together with patients, I guess, imagine the work the book can do in bringing into conversation these quite radically different spatial, political, structural, and social contexts to make this conversation as meaningful as possible.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. No, I think that's one of the, I mean, as the book is developed, I think that's become like a really sort of maybe the central thing for Patience and I, kind of thinking about bringing in these kinds of cross-regional conversations. And I would just like maybe just briefly mention three. So first, there's a social justice component to this, I think, that I'd like to flag, is that because often I think in analyses of DIY practices and urbanism, these are often very much, they remain very much embedded in the places in which they occur. So it's, that neighborhood, that community. But what this project, along with other work that we've been doing and folks on the panel as well, I think, demonstrates is that often people residing in wildly divergent settings and grappling, they're grappling with the same kinds of challenges. This is, whether we're talking about infrastructure deficiencies, having access in a regular way to water or energy resources, coping with urban flooding and extreme weather during the accelerating climate crisis. And I can tell you that working in Detroit and, in different cities in sub-Saharan Africa, I can tell you that community-led or organized solar powered device charging stations, that you find in poor communities, they don't look all that different, and they exist to serve and are designed to mitigate similar infrastructural deficits and socioeconomic inequalities. And so, so putting in conversation communities that might otherwise, be completely siloed from one another, offers, I think, a way to trade insights and experiences, but also becomes a way to build some kind of scaffolding for mobilization. What Patience and I have been talking about, in terms of platforms for solidarity, right? That might generate more sort of transformative or structural change that challenges in a more sort of focused and deeper way these kinds of entrenched inequalities. Second, I would also say, though, that this isn't to say that DIY urbanism is a panacea to solve these kinds of challenges, because it is not. And I think that these kinds of regional conversations demonstrate the limitations that are inherent in these kinds of practices, right? That DIY responses to climate change, for example, that might happen in sub-Saharan Africa or the post-industrial Midwest or in other places, are often a reaction to policies, decisions, and lifestyle choices that are taken, in places quite far removed, right? So, if DIY urbanism, if it's locally focused, is necessarily only going to be able to react as opposed to solve sort of these larger sort of global problems. And so thus, I think these cross-regional conversations also show us the importance of the state in supporting and incubating those activities and that are necessary to make them more effective, responsive to community needs, and sustainable. And lastly, just to loop it back to Sweden, and go back to this, pamphlet that, that we all got a few years ago. The focus, I think, on domestic crisis preparedness and what we would do when the war or crisis comes, I think could be recalibrated in light of what we learned from the African context, for example. Primarily, that crisis preparedness and management is not solely, or even mostly, I would say, a technical or a technocratic management problem, right? It's, we need to sort of consider what is the role of trust in social capital between citizens and institutions to make preparedness work. What skills and expertises are necessary to manage and minimize risk during a prolonged crisis? How do we account for the fact that some members of society are going to be better prepared to prepare for a crisis, right? And this introduces a class dimension that is often sort of shoved to the side, I think, in these conversations, right? So this is not to say that these lessons are transferable one-to-one, right? But I think it's like these kinds of cross-regional conversations, they open a space in which it's possible to learn from what is being done elsewhere, and also to achieve a better understanding of the kinds of expertises that are necessary beyond prepping a box of supplies to manage a longer-term crisis. And so I think I have more to say.
You're going to have to stop now for now, but I mean, I really appreciate that. And on the one hand, just things that you've said in terms of this DIY-ism is about sort of some kind of autonomous creative, etc., responses to taking care of, but not outside of, I mean, it's always within a state framework, and what that relationship with the state is a big question. And I'm pleased that I will be turning to Matthias in a moment. But the other thing that I really want to re-emphasize is this notion of preparedness is not simply a technical matter. It's about forms of relationality. It's forms of how one as an authority also deals with sort of all this seemingly uncontrollable, but what's the relationship in there? And so both those kind of questions are going to come up both in relation to Matthias and Victoria afterwards. So let me now turn to you, Matthias, who has worked actually more directly, overtly with authorities, I think, or at least with some state or formal authorities. But let me just start by saying that but actually, on the other hand, you're also talking very distinctively about urban activism in your chapter. That comes up very strongly. So among other things, we learn from your chapter the ways in which both various historical and contemporary forms of DIY urban activism, whether it's utopian, pragmatic, or officially permissible or not, how these have influenced city planning in some contexts. At the same time, you address the complex question of what kinds of spatial fragmentation, existing spatial fragmentation, and what you describe as deplorable conditions have prompted this expansion of DIY urbanism in Africa. People have no choice in many cases but to act on their own behalf. So despite the clear shaping of urban dysfunction in many cities as a result of politics, so what is generating this fragmentation and this dysfunction? Often it's politics, it's party politics, it's elite politics, etc. You note, interestingly, and I'm quoting here, that citizen-led urban interventions are often devoid of any underlying political motivation in the sense of politics. Could you expand on the point and say something about the implications for longer-term urban change or for forms of city making of this seeming lack of politics behind DIY urbanism? So what is, I have a second follow-up question, but maybe you can start with that.
Thank you, Amanda. For us here in Africa, you find out nearly every facet of our life is defined by the local politics. That Abuja is the capital of Nigeria today was a political decision. It used to be Lagos. And so every aspect of it is driven by politics. But the response to this dysfunctional politics that has created the myriad of urban problems that we have would not be to match it with politics, because you understand how fragile the democratic institutions here on the continent are. And if you approach it with a political lens, then it might end up with a shouting match and nothing gets done. So my approach has always been to have the buy-in of the state in DIY urbanism. So right now there's a conflict because the citizens cannot wait forever for the states to provide infrastructure, while the state, on the other hand, is saying the citizens don't have enough resources to build befitting infrastructure. So that's where the conflict is.
The conflict is, go on, yeah?
Yes, and so now what I was proposing in the book is to have this as a collaborative tool for placemaking, where the states and the citizens meet halfway. And so we see, rather than have us wait for 20 years for roads that would never come, or having us build like wafer-thin roads that would become deplorable after 2-3 years, then how do we meet at the center? So that has been the crux of my chapter.
Okay, so this politics that I'm trying to sort of unpack a little bit more. So in some ways, you're more optimistic than some of the others. I haven't read all the chapters, but some others, in the sense that you see potential and you certainly want to see more of this collaboration. But I'm wondering what makes you more optimistic than some of the others. For example, is the fact that what you describe as these DIY actions, these sort of interventions, self provisioning, they're not the same as people demonstrating against the state and saying we want, it's actually people just doing. So does that mean that it's less threatening to states? Does that make you more optimistic about the potential for collaboration? between state authorities and various kinds of initiatives, DIY initiatives?
Yes, so this is it. The African politicians usually have a very low threshold for criticism. And if you want change, you have to you have to sell to them. You have to make them have a buy-in that we need this. How do we go about this? Rather than the accusative accusative performance that you normally have in the West, where if a city needed a bicycle lane, you can mobilize your people, and overnight you can have one drawn, and tomorrow it's a bicycle lane. And here, if you do that, you get thrown into jail, and it defeats the whole aim. Like, we don't need that drama. We don't need the drama. Why not come together and have this? It's going to be a patchwork of compromises between the citizens, between those in government and all. We understand why we have this problem. We understand why we don't have good roads, corruption, mismanagement, and all of that. But let's not dwell on the cause of this problem. How do we solve it? Okay. So that is the
good. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'd like to move now, if I may, to Victoria. And it has a relationship to this question as well, but a little bit different. So your chapter, Victoria, focuses on the notion of urban commoning. People really do need to read your very rich chapter about this. They may want you to say a little bit about what you mean by urban commoning, but it's the way I've understood it is a process and practice through which residents of a densely populated, well, in your example, ethnically heterogeneous neighborhood in Accra, in Ghana, and I quote, self-organize to meet their everyday needs. And it's explored particularly through their uses and transformations of public spaces. And here you conceive of those as urban commons. So maybe you don't have to explain so much, but on the urban commoning. But importantly, you concentrate, and I've made this point very strongly, also in contrast to, excuse me, Matthias, you concentrate almost entirely on the residents' spatial practices, both their individual and collective practices. So it's very much, I don't like the term bottom up, but it's very grounded in urban residents and their own spatial practices. And in the chapter, you also pose a certain dichotomy between these contrasting or contrast realities and actions of ordinary struggling residents on the one hand, and what you refer to as the disembodied planning and design techniques of Accra's local authorities. So we get a real sense of who these residents are, what their sort of movement and actions are, and yet the Accra and state local authorities are kind of quite, let's say more of a body that we don't really see them disaggregated. So it's an understandable privileging of residents in this residents' perspectives, but there's a more complex array, I'd suggest, of actors within this broad umbrella of authorities, of state authorities. So some may be more or less inclined towards this DI urbanism, others may be more, averse to it. So might there be a sort of disadvantage, per se, in simplifying or generalizing about formal planning authorities? Given this complex realities like the neighborhoods that you're working in, with local actors being quite varied, is there any meaningful place in your view for engagement between local residents in their spaces, in their activities, and engaging with planners, for example? And how might that happen?
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. Also, just thank you so much to Patience, Stephen, all of you, just for this space to talk about our work. It's always really important. I think there's ways in which we produce our ideas, but it is so critically important that we also find ways to come together and also find ways to make this relevant, right? So I'm really grateful to just be participating in this space. So yeah, thank you again for this question. I think for me, and Stephen and Patience spoke to this, the premise of the book is, a real focus on how people in African cities make life, how they mitigate risk, solve problems, as Stephen said, particularly in contexts when local authorities are unable or unwilling or retreating from, sort of not present to provide for these needs and to engage with these local knowledges. And so in many ways in this piece that's focused in the West African city of Accra, but in particular in this historic neighborhood of Gamashi, I'm really trying to center these local knowledges, not just as sort of practices of informality. Stephen talked a lot about sort of like there's lots of different registers or, you know, vocabularies through which we could have thought through this. But really trying to think with, you know, within this working class neighborhood, like centering residents and their practices, not just as spatial practices, but really trying to look at the deep dimensions of these practices as formations of livelihood, as formations of place and play, recreation, ancestral and religious practices that give meaning to sometimes these practices that we visually might just see on the street. And so I think what's really interesting is how this becomes really important for me to recognize that these are often practices that are frequently dismissed by planners and other local authorities, both historically, presently. And this can foreclose ways of the possibilities of seeing and discerning the city and experiencing the city as well. So I think in this chapter, what I'm trying to do is recall and remind us of these small and large practices that are always at play through the richness of this DIY frame, and also to, in many ways, you know, a sort of implicit, maybe it's less implicit, but sort of critique about the conventional ways that planning is done. And I think, you know, for me, you know, this really comes from part of what informs my response and even the way that I wrote this chapter and the work that I do is my own approach, my own experience working in Ghana and Nigeria and South Africa in capacities of urban planning and design and urban adequacy roles, and conversations as part of that, not just with these sort of, you know, residents, but also, you know, planning authorities who are also residents. Interactions, conversations, dialogues about what is planning, how can planning be undertaken, how do we address these? And I think for me, I'm continually interested about so often these are individuals, and I'm not gonna, you know, generalize to the entire continent, but in my experience of where I mentioned, you know, I think to me what's really interesting is, you know, so often we recognize that these individuals are coming from these or other communities, other neighborhoods within the city. They are often deeply familiar with these realities. And so I'm really interested in this sort of interplay between having a deep familiarity with these practices, their rationales, their realities, and then instituting and designing particular planning processes, right? Because when we look critically at the urban plans that have been and are being developed in many of these contexts, you know, by and large, these are spatial designs that are, you know, renderings that are reproducing, you know, modernizing frames, linear developmental trajectories. And so I'm interested in this sort of tension that is always there, right?
I hear you very well.
And I think what's also evidenced, you know, including my chapter and also other chapters in this book, is how, I mentioned this before, just this sort of, I think, yeah, I don't know, maybe this is reductive and maybe this is, you know, maybe this is repetitive rather, but just, I think I'm interested in how, you know, a context like Gamashi, it's history, right? We have across the continent, we have these deep, very complex and very situated histories, right? And so I'm interested in also this sort of disconnection that often happens between local, let's say, indigenous, migrant, diasporic realities and ways of using space that often don't connect or are not connected to planning.
Yeah.
But I think what this gets me thinking about, and also just to highlight, everybody should read the whole book, but I think everybody should also read Matthias's chapter, because I really appreciated how he also spoke at one point to this question as well. You know, he talks about how, I wrote it down here, you know, like municipal authorities often feign ignorance or simply refuse to acknowledge the fundamental role local communities play in shaping city and landscapes through DIY urbanism. I think for me, this is what's really, really interesting. For me, this is what's really, really interesting and really motivated so much of what I was trying to get through in this chapter. Sorry, just one last thing, which is, you know, the big question I keep coming back to is, what is planning actually?
Good question.
Particularly in this kind of African, you know, this is an edited book about DIY in African cities, right? So I'm thinking very specifically about African cities, but I'm thinking about my own experiences, right? Which is, you know, particular parts of Ghana, particular parts of Nigeria, particular parts of South Africa. What is planning, right? What counts as planning? What's the potential for these knowledges that are featured in so much of this book? and the practices that are featured in the book to really destabilize how we understand planning in these contexts. And this is not to romanticize the tensions and the politics that exist, right? Matthias also spoke about these politics, right? In terms of local authorities, but also in terms of at these grounded levels, right? But I think it's interesting to notice that there is indeed planning at work.
There is planning at work.
In the absence and the refusal of local, but sorry, in the absence and the refusal of local formal planning authority. So I think there's a possibility to really expand, like, what counts for us as planning?
I think it's a brilliant question, Victoria. I mean, me having been a bit of a planner in the past and having rejected that. And actually, the what is planning question is not, it's not an either or, because the realities are is that there is this formal planning that is deeply embedded in histories, colonial histories, post-colonial histories, of modern ideas of modernity and control and so on. So they're there. But so are all these other, and these forms of DIY do include forms of planning. So it's a wonderful, provocative and important sort of question that could generate another book on what is planning. So thank you very much for that. And I'm sorry I had to cut you short, but time is running. My next role is to turn to Jeffrey, who's also going to have the chance to ask some of you panelists a question. But here is to you, Jeffrey, who comes from a different, I mean, the work, you're not in the book as such, so you're more of a sort of a reflector, commentator, provocateur as well. So here I'd just like to say that one of the key aims of this particular event is to explore, as we said, lessons that might be relevant for global North, urban and civil protection, planners, policymakers, and so on. But we've already noted as well these very contextual differences. Those have become clear as we've talked. And I'm not going to even talk about the comparisons between what the context that Matthias and Victoria each have been addressing. But a key question then is related to how can one translate experiences and lessons of the kinds shared in this book, African experiences and knowledges and planning orientations. How can one translate these to make them relevant or even just recognizable to Nordic policymakers and given these very contextual differences? So, and then what productive forms of exchange and learning might this generate?
Yeah, thank you. This is really an excellent book that everyone should read, and I think provides us 5 important lessons that we can learn as policymakers. So the first lesson, I think, is that we need to figure out what citizens and residents are already doing outside the realm of the state. And we need to support those endeavors rather than squash them or start alternative ones. So there are great examples in the book about in the Zambian copper belt, people provisioning their own water, coming up with irrigation systems to plant their own food. In other contexts, in Nigeria, forming kind of local community patrols to police their own neighborhoods. Examples in Accra of inhabiting public space, young people playing football on public parks. And I think it's just important for policymakers to kind of figure out what these residents are already doing, and rather than kind of create new ideas or create new policies and throw money, support what is already happening. I think the second lesson is that we need to recognize that there are some things that the state cannot do, and that sometimes these DIY practices actually fill in the social gaps that the state cannot fulfill. And I'll just use an example of a personal story of moving to Sweden from the United States with a young family, and my wife got pregnant, and we had to navigate this new system that felt quite foreign to us. And one way that we did that was we hired a doula to help us with the birthing process, but also understand the medical system. And let me just mention, this Swedish social welfare state is the best. This is the best place to have a baby. You get 480 days of paid leave. You have all the support in the world. But there was some things that weren't there to support us. So at 1 o'clock in the morning, when my wife went into labor, we had to drop our 2-year-old off at our friend's place, and they had to kind of bail us out as we went to the hospital. When after we gave birth, we were quite lonely. It was the middle of December in a dark new place, and we started a Facebook group of international parents to kind of come together to so that we could support one another. And I highlight this because the book provides many examples of ways that people are supporting one another, helping one another to deal with challenges that the state cannot solve and shouldn't necessarily be expected to solve, dealing with loneliness and alienation. And I think when confronting crisis, Nordic policymakers should just kind of have this recognition that this is going on. The third lesson is that I think we can use DIY urbanism to reshape the state. So the chapter on Nigeria, chapter 6, uses this nice language of initiating change through everyday practices. So the state is not kind of separate from this story. And there's a lot of arguments throughout the book about whether it's the role of provisioning water in Zambia, or security in Nigeria, or ecological living in Durban, that change is happening and people have a voice. And this can actually be incorporated into some of state practices. The fourth is, and I think Victoria's chapter really does a nice job of this, is that we need to rely on urban communing and local knowledge. James Scott calls this métis, the kind of local skills that people have and kind of understand the situation better. So Victoria has these great insights in how the people of Gamashi know the back alleyways, which provides a whole texture of the city that the state could never understand. While I don't advocate the state kind of co-opting or controlling or necessarily always making visible these spaces, there is a need to kind of recognize this local knowledge. The final point I'll make is that the book brought up these insights of power, politics, and inequalities. And I think policymakers need to do a better job of being aware of these local inequalities, being aware of the local politics. In my work, I call it the everyday politics. But then here's my strong point: don't avoid them. These issues aren't apolitical. And I think what's really nice about this book is it brings out the politics of DIY practices. And I think I'll end here, but crisis, what I learned from this book and what we all can learn is that crisis actually can provide the opportunity for residents themselves to create and manage their cities. So that it's not always necessarily a bad thing.
Well, be on the receiving end of it, you'll know it's a bad thing as well.
Well, but new possibilities can emerge.
I agree.
I've written about this in other work, but that of course crisis is terrible and people are, but it could open up a new future.
Yes, and I totally agree with you. And I've worked myself on something called displacement economies, where I see what does displacement produce in terms of opportunities as well as very harsh realities. Thank you so much for that. So this opens it up more, but in fact, what I'm now going to do is turn back to you, Jeffrey, who has been allocated the chance to ask the panelists some questions of your own. I'm very aware that we're running out of time, so you also need to be aware of the fact that there's about I think you've got about 10 minutes in total to speak to the panelists. So if you go right ahead and take the floor.
Oh, well, I'll just ask this question to the panelists, and it's in this spirit of crisis. If Nordic countries were to face a political or economic crisis, what do the insights from this book teach us about how we can create cities that are inclusive for all? So the floor is open to the panelists.
Can I speak? So I would just like to respond to your question using some of your comments where you spoke about the lack of community support when you got to Sweden and all. And if you had read my chapter, one of the things I was speaking about was the whole sociocultural concept of Ubuntu. So it's origin in South Africa, but every African tribe has its equivalent. And so it's more about vested powers in the community. So it's I am because we are. And so it's without the community, there's no me. And without a community, there is no me. So now I think that is what the West could learn from Africa. So not really in terms of infrastructure, but in terms of the fact that people can come together to build things. Unfortunately, most of the African cities are now trying to be like Western cities. And so this very key component of communal living is one of the first casualties of modern cities. And so now you have residential estates that are driven by developers, and you have high fences, and you don't know your next door neighbors and all of that. So that very important component of placemaking that's been with us pre-colonial times, and it started fading right after that. And now it's for a city like Abuja, it's terrible. And so it's very heartwarming that you mentioned that. And for a Westerner, someone who's lived in the West, to appreciate that whole concept, I think it's something we Africans need to acknowledge a lot more. Like, how can we build cities that are inclusive? How can we build communities? So we might have all the skyscrapers and all of that, but are we a community?
Okay, and Jeffrey, I can go after. I mean, I think one of the key things that I, having lived through crisis and having studied crisis, is the importance of the state being able to focus resources on the most vulnerable, even when it might seem to be expedient to focus them in areas that might maybe regenerate the economy later. And I'll give an example. With the HIV/AIDS crisis in Southern Africa, it wiped out an entire generation of young, active people. And this was in a context of major austerity and no support for the elderly parents, grandparents, who ended up having to take care of the young. So if one had to look at, let's say, here within the North, where you have older populations, older people, and it might seem much more prudent to say, oh, well, you know, in the context of limited resources, being able to build all sectors of society, in particular the vulnerable, is that they themselves become a useful resource, providing what I'd call a context for social reproduction, especially in the context of long-term crisis. And that, I think, is absolutely key in thinking about how do you sustain social reproduction, and that sometimes the most vulnerable might be the most important resource.
Can I jump in too then? Are you finished, Patience? Yeah.
Yes.
No, I mean, just to build on Jeff's point and what Patience and Matthias were just saying is that you know, like thinking about like how like DIY opens up a space for different kinds of politics. I mean, and this is like where the conclusion of the book actually sort of like takes us, right? Is that there are within sort of these conditions of precarity or uncertainty or insecurity, like there is like what kind of politics emerges from that. And we play around with that idea, but again, I think we sort of in the book going back to, but yet it's not enough, and we need sort of, you know, DIY urbanism. I guess you can say it's only going to be as good and effective and sustainable as the institutions around it. And I think this is, you know, like one thing I really sort of want to hit here for thinking about this in the Swedish context is that and again, this takes me back to this, this pamphlet for, when the war crisis comes, because on page 4 of this pamphlet, there's like a little thought bubble that sort of asks like, this rhetorical question. It's like, what would you do if your life were turned upside down? And I think there's two things that come to mind. It's like, it's about going back to this idea of trust and equity. And I just want to sort of mention maybe two things sort of related to that, is that, on the trust side, or the sort of social capital side, preparation for a crisis starts well before the crisis actually happens, right? And it requires, I think, more than a box of supplies to manage it. Because in this pamphlet, there's like a quite lengthy list of stuff that people should have, and that's part of it, right? But but I think sort of thinking beyond that, and this is a key lesson of the book, is that resilience in a crisis. Resilience is a problematic word for different reasons, but I'll say that here. But resilience in a crisis, I think, is reliance on others. And I think, going back to some of the things that have been sort of lifted here today. And so a question, I think, for Sweden or other sort of Nordic, government like institutions, is to think about how can the state support citizen, engagement with each other, what's actually happening on the ground. But even more basic than that, just bringing people together. And this sort of speaks to Jeff's point about, like alienation or sort of isolation. I think how do we to make sort of preparedness sort of successful, sort of like over a long duration crisis, how do we get out of this kind of like bowling alone mentality, right? Where like of the Robert Putnam sort. And I think, in one idea I had, and I don't know how realistic this is, but I think, like a lot of like the universities, and I think like other sort of like, like state-run like employers, like they offer some resources to do like health, like, things like, join a gym or like do yoga, that sort of thing. But I think, could we think about that too? Could we incentivize sort of community sort of engagement, right? And, so like, rather than sort of just like, giving a few thousand crowns to join a gym, what about sort of joining like a social club or like a hobby club or these sorts of things where you're actually going to be able to meet people that you can turn to in a time of crisis? And just one more thing I think that I want to sort of mention about sort of the equity side is that, again, like the resources required to prepare require a pretty significant investment. And, and I think, for a lot of people, that's going to be difficult to do. And so so I think in a material way, like there should be some mechanisms for state support for people to actually prepare. And, and that class and inequality do sort of come into play. And that when we think about what would actually happen, is that there needs to be sort of this, there needs to be a guarantee, or at least an acknowledgement that there needs to be places and spaces in which DIY urbanism can occur, in which people might be, for example, over a long-term crisis, to grow their own food. I mean, some people are gonna, not have access to a yard or a summer house to go to. What do people do then? And I think like, that there's a tension that I see living in Malmö and in Skåne, between sort of the aspirations to prepare and be sort of self-reliant in a crisis, and like the land policies that say like the government, like uses, right? Like in Malmö, they've sort of torn up like a few colony gardens and these sorts of things. And I think, like there needs to be some, I mean, development, yes, but if we're going to do this, like we have to kind of put our money where our mouth is. And I'll stop there.
Victoria.
I'll just say briefly that I think sort of what I'm saying, maybe I'll be incredibly brief, because I think I think everyone has sort of said really important things, but I think when you first gave us this question, Jeff, I was thinking about in Matthias's chapter talking about Ubuntu, and then more recently I've been reading, work of Nigerian, Cameroonian writers and scholars. So in particular, like Francis Nyamjo, who talks about this concept of African incompleteness, this idea that every individual entity, right, a local planning authority, for example, is incomplete, that we necessarily have to work within interdependent relation with others. And I think this is really sort of, for me, what's been coming up in all of this, and that it's not just again, it's not just the individuals, the residents who are incomplete, but even the local planning authority, right? So what are the possibilities to think about collaboratively working together, recognizing our incompleteness and drawing on each other, right? And I just have to, before, as we were getting ready for this, I was telling patients about this amazing show on Netflix that I really love. It's called Super Team 4. It takes place in Lusaka, Zambia, in this context of crisis, right? Waste management, patients had mentioned this, waste management, issues with local authorities, et cetera. And it's about these 4 girls who are in school who become these superheroes. And they are led, very importantly, by this woman elder. And one thing that I really love about this show, I promise there'll be a point to this, is that this woman elder is always sharing these deep, deep proverbs, right? And one of the ones, I think this is the first episode that she talks about is, it is only when the teeth are united that they can bite. And this is talking about like unity diminishes our weakness and actually increases our strength. And so I think this goes to what Matthias was talking about, what Patience and Stephen were talking about, it's not just about that this unity, this strength, Igbo people also have this proverb, but it's also about this idea of, as Stephen was saying, like it's not just in that moment of crisis, but it is an everyday, lived, performed, practice kind of thing. What are the things that we could be doing now to build these, relations, social spaces of support, especially going to your point, Jeffrey, and thank you for sort of sharing your experience that also led us on this trajectory, such that when crisis inevitably happens, recognizing that crisis is inevitable, whether it's individual or collective, that we have individuals to draw on, we can support each other. Some of us have strengths, others have weaknesses, and it's those bonds that allow us to move that crisis together.
These are really brilliant insights. And I just want to emphasize there's a brilliant line in, I think, Stephen's chapter about shifting from do it yourself to do it ourselves. And, the story of me having a kid in Sweden, this whole process, both the state support, but also our kind of DIY support made me feel like a resident of Uppsala, gave me a community, gave me a sense of belonging, and both were really important. So I think it's this process of like doing it ourselves in the context of crisis, and often the most marginalized or kind of outsiders are left out of that. And I think what this book teaches us is that they need to be incorporated and are a crucial part of creating an inclusive city. The second thing I heard Stephen and others say is a continued investment in public space. And I think Victoria's chapter does a great job of this, but it's so easy in the context of crisis to kind of give subsidies for the private. In the United States, after during the pandemic, we all moved to our houses in the suburbs, and we, de-invested in public transportation, and it really has further polarized our country. And you can see that happening in some contexts in African cities, but I think in crisis, this is the most important time to actually use public space as a way to promote community interaction. That's something that comes out in several of the chapters. So I'll turn it back to Amanda.
Great. God, what a wonderful set of reflections. And thanks so much, Jeffrey. I think the question just opened this out, and we're sort of beginning, or not beginning, I mean, we are in the conversation already. I have been wanting to see if anybody is putting up Q&A questions before I come back to sort of reflect a bit on some of the bigger issues that have been put on the table. There is one question I can read from the Q&A, and if anybody is interested or anybody wants to just make a comment, whether it's read out now or not, please feel free, because we're wanting this conversation to be opened up as much as possible. There's somebody called Antehoneng Birhanu Bisho who's written, it's just the only one on the Q&A, and they've written, I appreciate the efforts made by the authors in instilling the concept of urbanism, and I think they would probably mean DIY urbanism, in association with crises management. However, how is it feasible in the situation of African contexts where resources are limited and the knowledge base of society and leaders are poor? I'm not sure if anybody from the panel wants to just respond to this idea that even though DIY urbanism is very, I'll come to you, Matthias, in a moment, it's sort of something that is encouraging, but is it a feasible strategy? I don't know, because obviously some of you have said clearly it's not a protocol, but what does it mean? So let's, oh, Matthias, you had your hand up. Do you want to just respond to that?
Yes, so in response to that question, Victoria had asked the question. She said, what is planning? And so sometimes DIY urbanism might not even come from the physical infrastructure, but how much contribution do we as citizens have to planning? So I think our building regulations and master plans have become too pedantic, and they do not acknowledge the peculiar sociocultural underpinnings of our local societies. And so it's not always about money, it's about participation. So cities should have people participating a lot more. And now we understand the resources are scarce, and as much as we blame people in government for not providing roads and all of that, they are actually contending with paucity of resources. Unfortunately, they've been wasteful, so that's why we don't cut them as much slack as we should do. But when you have all of these, all of the citizens involved, then we can plan the bigger resources, and we decide we need this more than we need that. And in my chapter, I mentioned the issue of the over $400 million of security cameras that were installed in Abuja. And to this day, it's been over 10 years and none of them has worked. So imagine if that went into roads, if that went into water. And so if we had sat down like a group and a community and discussed, this would have made more impact. And just lastly, here, the DIY urbanism now happens at different levels. So you have that at the block of flat level where you have like 4 or 5 people living together, and then they have what they do together, maybe waste disposal and all of that. You have that at the larger estate, and then you have the neighborhood, and also it's actually incremental at every stage. So at every stage, there's something to be done.
Okay, thanks, Matthias, for responding to that. I think we're not getting any more actual. Oh, we've got some more. Yeah, we've got some more. I've got 2 more that have come up. So Sebastian Bay has put a thank you to all. Have you identified any specific preconditions which enable DIY urbanism? How can government, this is an ironic in a way question, how can government encourage DIY urbanism, should it? Anybody want to try and respond to that? Let me ask the 2 questions that have come up. Oh, one has just vanished, unfortunately. All right, let's try with that question. So have you identified any specific preconditions which enable DIY urbanism? Should government itself be encouraging DIY urbanism, and if so, how?
I mean,
patience.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting because in the context that I kind of like, that I've worked, DIY urbanism or self-provisioning was encouraged by the state because they did not have the resources to provide the necessary infrastructure for all citizens, such as housing, for example. But within that encouraging of the activity, they still maintained an overall planning purview in being able to provide the trunk infrastructure for water, for servicing, and the organizing of community to manage these particular services, so not to leave them alone. As time went on, and I would say when DIY urbanism becomes potentially a space where the state then, in a context of protracted austerity, but also of privatizing and market-based forces dominating society, I would argue to say that it should not be so encouraged, because it also then moves to a space where the state relinquishes its responsibility for the provision of public goods that sustain society. And then it's not so much an issue about not having resources, but it's also there that they begin to privatize, much more privatized, gated spaces and concentrate there. And then it makes the city much more fragmented and breaks trust. So there's 2 aspects: state managed, supported, and there's also the slippery slope when it becomes fragmented and breaks trust.
Great, thank you. Actually, I'll just to add to that, if I may, I mean, in the Zimbabwean case, this not being able to provide housing, the Zimbabwe state quite some time ago, encouraged self-provisioning and allowed the sort of urban areas to grow. But when it was politically expedient to return to formal policy and planning statutes and rules, they used the very same self-provisioning space to evict people, blame them for not following the rules. So it's a slippery slope in many different ways. Okay, Stephen, you had your hand up in wanting to respond.
Just a quick thing to add on to that, because I think, you know, in the context of Detroit, say, like especially at the time of the bankruptcy and leading up to that and in the aftermath, I mean, you know, the municipal authorities like would be like, oh, like DIY urbanism, like great. Because then, you know, we don't have any money. So if people want to, you know, sort of plow their own streets or take care of like, you know, sanitation and that sort of thing, you know, we're happy to do that. But I mean, and that's the kind of, I mean, so you don't, you know, as Patience was saying, like you don't, you know, encourage DIY urbanism for as a way to sort of like abdicate what the state should be doing, right? But I think one thing where it should be encouraged, but again, I mean, this goes back to the point that I was trying to make earlier about, you know, that DIY urbanism is only sort of as good as the institutions around it. Is that, you know, that local sort of communities and neighborhoods, say in Detroit, where I've been working, you know, they know sort of what they need and like what they would like to see and how they would like to see it like implemented, right? So and often, I mean, so you know, like, you know, through sort of block clubs and different things, like, you know, folks are doing that. And I think where the state then can, you know, what the state needs to do is come in and be able to listen to and support what is being sort of like done. And then, you know, in that way, again, it's sort of a more dynamic like interaction, sort of DIY urbanism or not, right? So like, you know, that there's some sort of syncretism that happens then between sort of like local communities and sort of municipal authorities. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you very, very much. Okay, I've got a few more comments. There was Helen has written, very insightful. Thank you. Necessity is the mother of invention, they say. When there's a need, communities have to meet their own needs. In some cases, the implementation of conventional planning models clashes with inventions of communities as they are cleared to make way. It's a broad question. What do you say about this? I think I just leave it as more of a comment. And I'll bring here a question by Kelebohile Moapare. Hi, I was wondering if the Khotla system of Botswana was applied during the writing of the DIY urbanism. The Khotla, or if you took into consideration, which is you want to maybe Stephen explain that, what the Khotla system is in Botswana. I mean, I'm not going to read everything that's coming. We've just got a little bit of time for that. And Victoria, you can say something after.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, the Khotla system is just like a space in which the community would have a chance to talk to the sort of like the local sort of tribal like chiefly authority. And it was a place where, you know, like normally you weren't allowed to criticize the chief, and this would be a space where you could kind of raise like concerns or bring up sort of critiques and that sort of thing. No, I mean, so I mean, in terms of thinking about a public space for deliberation, I mean, we didn't really sort of think about that as like within the writing, but I think, you know, but it's interesting, right? To like think about, and this is, I think, like one of the challenges to, you know, sort of like this, like, you know, like this work of translation, sort of like, how do you bring these grounded, you know, sort of practices to state institutions, right? And get planners to actually sort of like listen to you. And I think that's like, that's been a real challenge because like, you know, like there's like, well, you know, like, people don't really sort of know what to do with this, right? Like from like a bureaucratic side. And so I think, you know, having, you know, so I think thinking about what are the spaces of conversation that we can sort of create and that allows sort of for this like open exchange of ideas, I think is, you know, like it's an important one, but one that we don't necessarily sort of get into too much in the book.
Not in the book, but in fact, it's a profoundly important point for this whole conversation is what are the feasible, productive, creative spaces of conviviality, to borrow Nyamjo's phrase. Victoria, you wanted to have you got a minute and a half or a couple of minutes?
Yeah, I'll just be quick, just to think
sure.
with Helen's super important question. it takes me back to, so before I moved into like doing a PhD in academia, I was doing a lot of work with market vendors, street-based vendors, particularly in the cities of Accra and Kumasi in Ghana. And so it was really interesting to think about how the deep histories of market vending and the clash with more modernist, literally modernization and the construction of modern markets, but also sort of the realities of these vendors where, to speak to the earlier discussion around, what Patience was talking about in terms of the way these things sort of overlap. On the one hand, you have local authorities who are taking money every day from these market vendors and street vendors to allow them to sell on the street pavement, et cetera, to allow them to be ambulating on the sidewalk pavement. But at the same time, when now they're sort of getting these large amounts of loans and investments to build modern markets, they are clearing the way to make room for modernity. And I think this really gets to this tension of, sort of what are the politics of these authorities, particularly in this context I'm speaking of in Ghana, right? And sort of how do we, and to think with what I think it was Stephen was saying, like, how do you get planners to listen to you, right? And one of the things that these vendors were doing was they were operating in associations, and they were actually taking the KMA, the Kumasi Metropolitan Authority, to court, right, to challenge some of their interventions. And so I think it's really interesting, sort of, what are the possibilities, what are the range of options that individuals and groups have that they can rely on and use to challenge when they are being cleared out of these spaces, right? To challenge sort of their ways of using space. So it's just to affirm that question and give a bit of.
Thank you. That's so good. And I think it's part of part of the summarizing, which we've only got a few minutes for. And I think one of the tensions that sort of come up in the conversations and in the chapters is, on the one hand, quite an optimistic and positive view of what states, and I say states in plural, there is no such thing called the African state. There are states in, real states in practice that are also very multi-layered and so on. So there is somewhat of an optimistic view from some that what are the possibilities, and also some examples of states working with and potentially supporting in complicated ways various forms of DIY urbanism. And then there are other sides of things, or also positions where we understand that it can be global circumstances, it can be, natural circumstances, it can be colonial histories that are creating the kinds of difficulties that are just intensifying. They're actually not getting much better for most people. And that people have to, as somebody wrote there, need is the mother of invention. You have to find ways. People are finding ways to either work individually to deal with their lives or collectively. And these examples are so incredibly rich and important. And they're also very particular to particular places, not just a country, but a neighborhood, a particular historic neighborhood in Accra. It might be different from Harare, which is also different from Bulawayo, two different cities in Zimbabwe, et cetera, et cetera. So let's say researchers have a lot of work to do to consolidate and surface through books like this, the kinds of lessons, the kinds of insights, but at the same time, the challenges and to some extent, the optimism. You need an optimism to imagine what kinds of possibilities of collaboration, of mutual listening, of, opening up spaces. And these are quite time-specific, space-specific, politics-specific. What we might see as a potential Lagos, becoming very much more open under a certain kind of leadership than it was in the past, etc. So, we're really we're mining, to use Patience's work, mining from fantastic resources and trying to open up these conversations, which we hope there will be more of. And particularly to think about these platforms of solidarity, which I thought was a great phrase, Stephen, that you used. And think about notions of trust, of equity, and of sociality. And that not thinking of planning, as you have asked this beautiful question, not what is planning, what could planning be, much less than a technocratic practice. So I want to thank all of you. I want to thank the audience for being here. You're invisible to us, but we know you're there through some of your Q&As, which we may not have responded to every one of them. Thank you very much to the Nordic Africa Institute for hosting and making this possible, and especially to all of you who have been on the panel. It's been wonderful. I want to then just reinforce how beautiful and valuable this book is to read, how many insights it has, and to dive into it and to respond to it, actually, either in your own contexts, through communicating with any of us, or with your own planning authorities. So I really want to thank you and wish everybody well for after this session. That's it.